I want to say welcome. I'm glad to see the people here who are here, because you are the people who were supposed to be here, right? Before I say anything else, let me ask the elder woman in the room if I have permission to continue.
Mm-hmm.
It's consistent with the best of African history and culture
Yep.
to acknowledge the elders in the room and get their agreement before we go forward with any deliberations. And since we're here to talk about the divine inspiration of women, it's only appropriate that we get that permission from the elder woman in the room. So with that being granted, we won't get into this. My name is Shujaa Baker. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. We're here to have a critical dialogue with our culture. And as mentioned in the flyer, this discussion titled The Divine Inspiration of Women, a Black Women's History Month Tribute, was to be a preview of a paper I was going to be presenting next month at the 37th Annual Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, or ASCAC Conference, right? That was to be scheduled from April 2nd to the 5th, and it was going to be held at Los Angeles Southwest College. I got notice earlier last week, that conference had been canceled. So whereas this was going to be a preview of that discussion, where I was going to get into and talk about the divine inspiration of women, that paper was going to be a discussion about what happens when enough women walk with an understanding of their divinity, right? So what I'm going to do, because the conference has been canceled, I'm going to wrap this discussion up with a brief video that I was planning to share as part of that paper, right? To get into a discussion about the beautiful things, the wonderful things that happen when the greatest number of women recognize and walk in their divinity. So, first question is, how do we find ourselves here today, right? And for me, my path began in the late 90s when I was sitting in church one Sunday, and it occurred to me that I've been doing that for years, quoting and toting the King James Bible, accepting it as the unaltered word of God like we're taught to do, but nobody hadn't bothered to tell me who King James was.
That's right, yeah.
Right? So I decided while sitting in church, dead square to the pulpit, maybe 4 or 5 rows back, that I need to know who King James was before I continue this. I mean, how did we miss the cover? We get together every week and talk about the Bible, but we ain't never talked about the cover. Ain't nobody bothered to tell me who King James was. What nation was he the king of? How did his book become the authorized version? I mean, who authorized that, brother? So I had already had a reputation for asking questions in church, which, don't always go over so well, right? So I scheduled a meeting with the pastor, and I went and had that discussion. Who is King James? He gave me a non-answer by telling me about some of King James' detractors and how people accused him of being a homosexual and all of that kind of stuff. And I said, well, Pastor, I could care less who he sleeps with. That's not my concern. I want to know, what nation was he the king of? How did his name come to precede the book that we're taught to accept as the Word of God? Who authorized that? You know what I'm saying? And my pastor looked at me with a look of concern and said, Brother Harold, if you pursue that line of questioning, it's going to mess up your relationship with God. That's what he said. He didn't know me well enough at that time to know that he had just lit a flame that couldn't be extinguished. What I said to him immediately was, Pastor, and I did this. Over here, we have God. Over here, we have King James. They are not one and the same. So how can me learning something about this one mess up my relationship over here? And of course, he didn't have an effective response to that. And I left his office knowing, without having an answer to my question, and knowing that he wasn't interested in me getting an answer to that question. But I felt this was a question I should be able to get answered in church. So I didn't give up on church yet. I went to the co-pastor, who was a woman. And to her credit, she admitted that she didn't know, but she didn't try to discourage me from finding out. So I went home, and this was in the late 90s, 98, 99, somewhere around there. Internet was just happening. I had AOL at home. I went home and did one of my first internet searches, right? I did a search for chronology of the Bible. It brought up a book by Dr. Ben, and that's where it all began for me, right? That's where it all began for me. So within a day, all of it was like the onion was peeling itself. The layers was just falling off, you know. So I'll say this before I move on. So I went back to church the next Sunday, and I had a different set of questions for the pastor. I scheduled some time with him, and I said, Pastor, I just got one question for you today. Just one. What is it? I said, I want to know what the difference is between truth and fact. And he looked at me and shook his head. Harold, you're going to drive yourself crazy asking these questions. You need to develop your faith. You know, that's what you're missing. You know, that's the conversation he had for him. And I just looked at him while he was saying that nonsense. And I said, well, Pastor, truth is, I already know the answer to that question. I just wanted to see if you did. And of course, that changed everything. You know, and it was from that moment that I began to feel unwelcome there. You know, I had an office in the church. I was a steward in the church. I had responsibility for oversight of the finances and all of that stuff, which I did to the best of my ability. It was then when he started doing games and tricks and all of that stuff, trying to get me frustrated so that I would eventually leave. And my Lower East Side Detroit fighter instinct kicked in, and I was about to do all types of things, you know, with him until that co-pastor, that sister, you know, told me in the way that sisters do, you know, brother, this ain't your fight. It's time for you to move on. That's what this means. It's time for you to move on, and so I did. So that was where it began for me. My direct path here, though, kicked in 2005. That was when I submitted my first paper to an academic conference. That was also the year that I took my first class with Dr. Karanga down at Cal State Long Beach and started getting in deeper into the studies of Africa, African history and culture and all of those things. But of course, the most direct connection between me and Crash Unity began in 2006 when I moved to Long Beach and happened upon a place called Shades of Africa and found out that they had a study group every Thursday night that had been formed in 1988 by a brother named Olufemi Vilps after he attended what I think was the second or third ASCAC Conference in Kemet. A directive was made at that conference they took like 1,000 black people, you know, to tour Egypt so that they could see the pyramids and the temples and could see that our ancestors had a sense of what was coming. So they took these truths about us and they carved them in stone on the wall to make them that much more difficult, you know, to be removed and destroyed so that we could come back here centuries later and see with our own eyes what they were teaching, what was there for us, right, against the distortion. So they took 1,000 black people over there. And after that, Olufemi Vilps came home and started the Long Beach Study Group. I came upon them in 2006. So by the time I walked in the door over there, black people have been meeting in Long Beach every Thursday night to talk about us in a dignity-affirming, uplifting way for almost 20 years. For almost 20 years, with few exceptions, right? So for almost 20 years. And then in 2009, 3 years after I got involved, Baba Olufemi Vilps and Baba James Thomas, who were running the study group at that time, they took an extended vacation and they turned the group over to my dear brother, now an ancestor, Kwesi Osafo, who had been involved since the beginning. And, you know, Crass know Kwesi and us, you know. Kwesi, once the elders contacted him, Kwesi contacted me immediately because we had become friends through the study group, and we talked about how the study group was really more of a discussion group, and we wanted to, you know, restore it to a full study type of capacity. So when the elders turned the group over to Brother Kwesi called me, and we got to work immediately. The very next week, we had a schedule, a curriculum, and we were doing a book study the very next week. And that went on until I retired from the group in 2017, right? In 2011, we reorganized and formed the African Restoration Project of Long Beach. It's also of Pomona. It's now of Los Angeles. It's wherever we are doing this work, right? And the name, the African Restoration Project, was inspired by Tony Browder's ASA Restoration Project. That's named in tribute to Asa Hilliard, who's one of our great scholars. It is the only archaeological dig to ever happen in Kemet done by African American people, financed and actually the labor being done by African American people. So that's significant. Through our work down there, the African Restoration Project of Long Beach came to be known as one of the most consistent, if not rigorous, study groups around. Both myself and Brother Kwesi were engineers, and we approached the study of our history like engineers, you know. So we were very rigorous about it, and it went on. It was very successful. We averaged like 20 people, you know, showing up there, which is huge for a study group in Los Angeles, you know. But word got out that we did work. Matter of fact, Reverend Mary Kara, principal here at Karad, spoke to us on occasions about the scope and scale of the work that we were doing, complimenting us. I remember one conversation I had with Reverend Mary Kara. He was so pleased with what we were doing. I remember sending him a whole trove of writings and stuff, you know, just having a wonderful discussion with him. One of our single proudest moments came when Earl 5X Grant heard about our group and decided to visit us. And after visiting us, he was so pleased with what he saw that he decided that he wanted to come back and teach with us. Now, Earl 5X Grant might not mean much to everybody, but I understood when what happened was we were doing the study group, and I saw three brothers who I knew, Mathu, Okira, and for some reason the third brother's name escapes me right now. It'll come back to me, but he was the one who Professor Grant lived with. Oh, why can't I call his name? It'll come back. But I saw them walk in the door to the study group one day, and they were Tahuti. Yes, Tahuti. Thank you. These three brothers were moving in a huddle around an elder, and I knew he was royalty by the way they were moving around him. You know, so I whispered to Brother Kwesi. I said, "Well, who is that?" And he said, "That's Earl 5X. I'm a student of Malcolm. I'm a Malcolmist first, right?" So I immediately recognized the name Earl 5X. I said, "Malcolm's Earl 5X?" He said, "Yeah." And I'm awestruck now, because not only did I not know he was still alive, but I didn't know he was in Los Angeles, and was thrilled beyond measure that he was there in our study group. That was huge, right? So he was the vice president of Minister Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity. After he left the Nation of Islam, he showed me the card. Vice president of the organization. He was Malcolm X's official photographer and videographer. So a lot of the videos that we see of Minister Malcolm, a lot of the photographs of Minister Malcolm, he took them. Some of the audio recordings of speeches, he made those, right? But not only that, he was an independent and rigorous scholar in his own right. I met him when he was in his late 80s. When he found out I was an engineer, he asked me what I knew about quantum physics. And I told him I don't know much. You know, I don't know much, but what do you know? What do you know? Let's have a conversation about it. This man engaged me in a depthful discussion about quantum physics. I was blown away, but not only that, his range of knowledge was unlimited. He came back to our study group about 12 times and taught on everything from quantum physics to sexuality and ancient Kemet, divine role of women, families, all kinds of stuff. He came back and taught on. Let me see. And as I mentioned, members of the Crash Unity family regularly attended ARPLB. In fact, Sister Teddy Sherry was a regular attendee down there. And I saw her a few months ago out in the world somewhere. And through that conversation, I'm here. You know, I began it with Sister Teddy Sherry. I had follow-up conversations with Sister Erica and eventually with Sister Simsut. who worked with me to arrange the 2 sessions that we have scheduled. So, in other words, we're having this conversation only because I was ready for it. I was ready to have it when the divine feminine called for it, right? That's why we're here, because I was ready for it when the divine feminine called for it. So I give many thanks to Sister Teddy Sherry, Sister Erica, and Sister Simsut in all of their divine roles, and to the divine spirit in all of them that reflects the divine inspiration we're here to talk about. So right there, you got 2 photographs of us. On the left, you have myself, Brother Mathu, Earl 5X, and Brother Quadio Safo, and then Brother Abdullah, who was one of our regular attendees at the study group. On the right, you have a picture of me and Earl Grant, Earl 5X, at his home. And you can tell it's many years later because I got, hair, longer hair. I'm, short, faded on the left, and I got locks, over my shoulder on the right. So that was a few years later. I am at his home in that picture. I went to his home because I had written a paper that I submitted to another academic conference called The Conversation We Need to Have with Minister Malcolm, where I was offering something of a radical interpretation of some of Minister Malcolm's teachings post-Mecca. And since I had his number, and we on a first name basis, I couldn't think of anybody. I might have called Malcolm's daughters if I could get to them, but I could get to Earl 5X, and I couldn't think of anybody else that I could talk to who could give me better insight on what Malcolm might think about my interpretation here. So I had this discussion with him about it, and he didn't agree with everything that I said, but he certainly appreciated the direction that I was coming from and the thought that went into it, and he saw it as forward thinking that needed to be pursued. So he blessed the paper then, and for me, that was as big as it gets. That was as big as it gets. So I'm glad we didn't cancel today. I'm glad we didn't cancel today. In the midst of the chaos, we need to look within ourselves to preserve our sanity and chart a new course forward. And there's no better way to look at ourselves or to re-engage with our culture than to broadly consider what African culture has to say about the divine nature of women. The title of the conference that was canceled, the theme of the conference was Sisters Without Peer, the role of women in African civilizations. And the title was appropriate because when you look at the historical record, sisters are without peer in terms of the status that black women had, African women had in African cultures. And you're going to see that here in crystal clear form. Women in ancient Kemet were not only leaders, owning property, but they occupied some of the highest positions in the society, So you don't find that in other people's history, right? So it was correct to say, to title that conference Sisters Without Peer, because that's the ultimate truth of the matter, right? So to talk about context and objectives here, as I mentioned, no better way to engage our culture than to look at what our culture has to say about women. The purpose being to understand how that perspective was engaged to gain the inspiration needed then to define and construct ancient societies towards greatness, long before the invasions and conquests led us to forgetting that understanding, bringing us to where we are today, right? Because we truly have forgotten who we are. Many of us, not all of us, right? The women here at Caras are well aware of their divine nature. No question about that. They live in it. But women outside, not so much. Certainly not to the degree required, right? And myself, I've been actively participating in this discussion for over 10 years, talking about the divinity of women. And here are some examples of some of the discussions that we've had in our study groups, that speak to the divine nature of women and those things. This was one titled "The Mother's Protective Instinct," celebrating women warriors and activists who paved the way in the spirit, women working in the spirit of the goddess Oya, and that was just a couple of years ago we had that one. This was another one during the same March where we were celebrating women's history. These are our first teachers, women scholars and scientists who paved the way. And what I always set out to do was not only recognize some of the ones who people have heard of, but introduce some women who people hadn't heard of. who had made some significant contributions to the forward flow of history, and we were able to do that. Here's another one we did, where we talked about new voices, women's voices of a new generation, those women who are leading the way now. And you know, these are like sisters like Tarana Burke, the Me Too movement, right? Because we see that movement having real impact on the society that we live in now, showing how the world will change when women decide the world will change, right? So that was what that discussion was about. And in fact, that was going to be the title of my paper at the conference. The world will change when women decide the world will change. And that's not to say that women have the exclusive role, responsibility for doing that. You know, you need righteous men as part of that too. There's no, you know, I'm not letting us off the hook, you know, but as I'm here to talk about today, there's nothing that inspires a man more than women, you know, so when we get to what it takes to get there, you know, it's that inspiration that we need. So as mentioned, the women here at Crass are well aware of their divine nature. They live it. Women outside, not so much. Certainly not to the degree required. Those of us who have studied this material and recovered this knowledge have not done as good a job as we need to, sharing it with the masses of our people. Thank you. This discussion is only an introduction to that material, right? Organized in a way to reflect my thoughts on a strategy for introducing it to our people more broadly, who are still deeply committed to the religious traditions we inherited. My central thesis is that we have been mistaken in our search for a new leader. The leader we need is in the mirror, waiting to be recognized. I'm going to say that again. The leader that we need is in the mirror, waiting to be recognized. Therefore, we don't need leadership. What we need instead is to be inspired to do what only we can do to become the best possible version of ourselves. So we need inspiration, not leadership. So the conditioning that we've had that causes us to look for not only a leader, but a male leader, has taken us completely away from our greatest source of inspiration. Because indeed it's true, I don't think I'm going to get any argument, certainly not from the men in the room, that nothing inspires men more than women. We know that. Can I get an amen? Can I get an ashe?
Pretty much.
All right? But
Well, I'm thinking of children.
I know.
My biggest inspiration is children, but I agree with you.
But hold on, I'm glad you said that. Hold on. I'm so glad you said that. Because if your greatest inspiration is children, you gotta go to where them children come from, brother.
That's right.
Hold on.
That's right.
Hold on.
That's right.
We talking about the chicken or the egg. What come first? Right? So
right.
it all goes back to women. And we know that children themselves get more inspiration from women, their first teachers, mothers, than anybody. Right? We know that. What we aren't always so tuned into, though, is the fact that nothing inspires women like other women. Do I need to say that again, or y'all know that's true? That's absolutely true. The bonds that women form when they are in harmony are incomparable to any other human relationship, right? Women working together in harmony, grounded in an understanding of their divinity, change the world. Have done it, are doing it, and will do it again. That's what we're here to talk about. So, with that, I contend that nothing inspires men and women more than women. So while we've been looking for that male savior or that male leader, we've been blind to the women inspiration around us, which is what we really need. Do you have a question?
No, comment. I have some, like what you said, how women can change the world. I wanted to say how my Bowie had made harmony with other women and actually stopped a war, like you
Now, I love my son. My son is giving away my goods before I get there, which is okay. It just means he's paying attention.
That's right.
But you are absolutely right, son. You are absolutely right. That was a perfect observation. You are absolutely right. So before I get into a discussion about divine inspiration, I gotta pay homage. Please, Sister
Just
Teddy.
to piggyback a little bit, when you think about when we were growing up and you see all the women in white, the big women in the kitchen working, you're like, how are women working up in there? And they all just is a flow.
Yeah.
And you're right. You're right. I mean, we see that when we have our women come together and it just, everybody just has their thing.
You know, I pay homage to Mary McLeod Bethune here in a moment, and I quote her because I love her, right? The wisdom that she drops is just phenomenal. I share a couple of quotes in here, but there's another one that's related to what you said. Mary McLeod Bethune said, men have a way with writing policy, but women have a way with getting things done.
Right.
Do I need to say that again? I think everybody in this room recognizes the truth in that. Men have a way with writing policy, but women have a way with getting things done, right? So any movement, anything we've ever done that's been of value has been done with the direct input, assistance, and guidance of women. And anything that we will do will be constructed similarly. You know, some people don't understand that. But before I get into a full-throated conversation about the divinity of women, divine inspiration, I can't begin without recognizing the divine beings in my life who inspire me, right? I roll with them all the time, everywhere, whether they physically with me or not, right? They are always there, right? So I'm paying homage first to my beloved Sarah, my friend and partner in life and struggle, because it was Sarah's divine spirit and nature. Through her divine spirit and nature, I'm able to pay homage as well to our two little ones, Amini Asar, the son of a woman of Nubia. That's a quote that came out of the book where I got his name. And Lima Asek, what is my purpose? That's also derived from the source for her name. And those, of course, were older pictures. That's from when I did this presentation, about 6 years ago, or a version of this about 6 years ago. And here we are now. And I dedicate this to them, to my wife Sarah for obvious reasons, but also to my children. And I dedicate it to Amini, that he may always know, honor, and call forth the divine within himself as a means to help manifest the divine masculine, but especially divine feminine, for him to recognize that and help manifest that more broadly all around us. Also, I dedicate this in an even more special way to my daughter Lima, that she may always reflect, demand, and receive proper respect for being the divine feminine that she is and was born to be. Ashe?
Ashe.
And here I go into a discussion about her name and how we were inspired to name her, and the woman who inspired us to take her name for our daughter, Lema Bowie. Anybody in here familiar with a sister named Lema Bowie besides my son? Lema Bowie, and we gonna discuss this. I got a little clip of her that I'm gonna wrap this whole thing up. Lema Bowie, long story short, among her many accolades, she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. And I don't say that because it means so much to me, but because it means so much to other people, right? She got the Nobel Prize. She shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011 for work she did leading a women's movement in Liberia that brought an end to their second civil war. Led a women's movement in Liberia. And this is modern day stuff. This just happened 2008, 2009, when they brought the war to an end, and she was rewarded with the Nobel Prize in 2011. So because of her work and because of the significance that it represents in terms of calling forth the collective power of women, we decided to name our daughter after her, in the interest of having our daughter also follow that same tradition, and be developed to that extent herself and call forward the same thing in other women. I'm using 2 books as principal sources for this discussion. First is the African Heritage Study Bible, which is a King James Version Bible. I use this because of for 2 reasons. And I don't know if sisters frowning because of the book or not, but I use this because this is where most of our people are. And if you're going to, and that's one of the problems that we've had in connecting this deeper information with our people, is because our people are over here, and so many of us have moved past this that we waiting on them to catch up. My other source is the single most widely used text for black studies at the college level anywhere in the country. That's this book right here, Introduction to Black Studies, that was written by Dr. Maulana Karenga, who is also the creator of Kwanzaa, and he's one of my teachers. I mentioned that when I met him, when I hooked up with him in 2005, that was just instrumental to everything that I am, being able to sit at his feet. I keep a list of questions. I really literally keep a list of questions so that when I have the opportunity to, I can pull out the right question, for him. When I have the opportunity to sit at the feet of one of the masters, I want to be ready. I also use these other 3 books, the Hosea, the Odu Ifa, and the Book of Coming Forth by Day, but the contents of those are reflected in this book. The individual books are more extensive, in their discussion of the related material, but each one of them is addressed in this book. Chapter 5 in this book is a cold piece of work. It's titled Black Religion. And in that chapter, he introduces us to the ancient Kemetic spiritual tradition called Ma'at. He introduces us to the Yoruba tradition called Ifa. He introduces us to the Dogon tradition. He introduces us to critical players in the black Christian tradition. He introduces us to the critical players in the black Islamic tradition. He gets all into black religion, right, to give us some access to that and some exposure to it. And in those pages, we get an introduction to what all of those traditions say about women. I'm really focusing on creation narratives in this discussion, because I could do a multi-week series on any one of them. The depth is there. But for the purposes of today's discussion, it's an introduction to them, and I'm generally focusing around creation-type narratives. All of these texts have a common link, though. All of them, including the Bible. And what is that common link? Greetings, Reverend Mary Carvalho. Good to see you, sir. All right. And a lot of people, particularly people who are grounded in this book, when you start talking about Egypt, their face curl up, they eyes start getting wandering and everything. They start hyperventilating, strange things start happening because they've been taught that in spite of what the truth is about the connection to Egypt, they've been taught that Pharaoh believed in evil things. They've been taught about the supposed enslavement of the Hebrews, all of that stuff. So you start talking about Egypt with them, and they want to end the conversation quickly or, go in the other direction. That's because they don't know their own text, right? I quote here from the book of Acts in the New Testament, where it tells the story of Moses, who, of course, is one of the principal characters in the entire text. It tells the story of Moses' coming into being and how Moses was an Egyptian. And in the narrative, it talks about Moses because of the king who was going to kill all the little boys. You know the story. Moses was put into the Nile River at the tender young age of 3 months or something to that effect, and was rescued by the Pharaoh's daughter, taken into the kingdom and raised as the son of the Pharaoh's daughter. That's right there in the text. I've quoted it right in here. Book of Acts chapter 7. You can go to it. It says here, when you get down to around verse 22, it says, "And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in word and deed." Say that again. Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in word and deed. I shared that quote with a pastor one time, not the pastor who I was talking about earlier, but a different pastor. And I challenged him with that. You know, if Moses was learning in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians, why do you say the things that you do about the Egyptians? And he said, his response to me was, yeah, well, he might have been learning in all of that, but he moved past all of that. He let all of that go, you know. And I said, no, he didn't. And I knew that he didn't because I know the tradition. I know enough about what the ancient Egyptians taught to be able to see it and what Moses carried forward. You know, talk about the Ten Commandments. We know in this room that the Ten Commandments is a subset of the laws of Ma'at, the declarations of innocence. You know, we know that. One particular difference is key, that in the Ten Commandments, it's a directive. Thou shalt not. Coming from an authority. You don't do this. In the declarations of innocence, it says, I have not done. I have not done. It takes ownership. I have not killed. You know, I have not stolen. Those types of things. That's a different conversation, right? Consistent with that, in the ancient Kemetic tradition, you don't get an admonition that you're supposed to love everybody, and certainly not that you're supposed to love your enemies. You get an admonition that you're supposed to make yourself lovable. That's a completely different conversation that has a completely different set of norms, practices, and everything tied to it, right? That perspective would create a different society, right? I mentioned earlier how Mary McLeod Bethune is a principal inspiration for me. And most everybody has heard of her. She was a great educator and advisor to presidents, leader of so-called the Black Cabinet, founder of Bethune-Cookman University, and the National Council of Negro Women. Some of the great legacies of Mary McLeod Bethune are left in her abundant records from decades of dedicated service to the public. And as I mentioned, I reference two of her teachings almost continuously. The first is, if you want to measure the character of a community, take a look at its women. If you want to measure the character of a community, take a look at its women. Next, and then second, next to God, we are indebted to women. First for life itself, and then for making it worth living. First time I read that, that was a drop the mic moment. You know, because I mean, in my own life, ain't nothing more true than that. Next to God, we're indebted to women. First for life itself, and then for making it worth living. I couldn't imagine what life would be like if there were no women here. I'm gonna get into this a little bit more, you know, explicitly in a little bit. I can't help it. I gotta say it now, because the truth of the matter is that if, for some strange reason, the Creator, for reasons that wouldn't make any sense to me, should decide to remove all of the women from earth, well, me, a few of these other brothers in this room, the very next thing we're gonna do is find a cliff so that we can take a flying leap off into eternity looking for y'all. Because if y'all ain't here, what we here for? Right? That's fair to say? Yeah. So that's consistent with, that's why I like that teaching so much from Mary McLeod Bethune. Wow. Next to God, we're indebted to women. First for life itself, and then for making it worth living. But on an even deeper level, why are we here? You know, we could ask that question in the broadest terms, right? Why are we here as, you know, human beings, you know, eternal spirits having a human experience? As I think I first heard Reverend Mary Kara say. What are we doing here? Well, I can say with confidence that this occasion has been on its way since the beginning of time. In other words, I'm not alone in raising this topic for discussion. This topic is taking place all over the world right now about the divine nature of women. The teacher priests say it's because of the change of the celestial age we're experiencing, which speaks to a certain energy emanating from the center of the universe or parts between and reaching us in this time and space with its distinct qualities and influence. Charles Spence told me that. Charles Finch is a ER doctor in the Atlanta area, and one of our most highly regarded scholars of Kemetic studies. Had lunch with him one day, and we asked him, well, what's going on? Because he was talking about the change of the age and all of that. And he said that what we're experiencing now is the reception of energy that has been projected from the center of the universe, that's bringing with it this new consciousness, that we're experiencing. And I feel it, and I think other people feel it too. So, that made sense to me, when I heard him say that. But there are two moments that in my life that stand out, because one of the first questions that I'm asked whenever I'm engaged in this topic is, well, what changed for you? I mean, you grew up in this society too. So at what point did you stop with all of the foolishness, and perspectives of women, and start seeing this divine thing that you talk about? Well, there are two key points that I speak to in response to that. The first was a moment from my childhood during one of our periodic visits to church, when I first perceived there was a problem in the way this society sees women. And that was when, I don't remember exactly how old I was, but I estimate that I was somewhere between the age of 7 and 10, and we didn't go to church every week. We showed up once or twice a year, if that, right? So this was on one of those occasions, and I remember sitting in the pew next to my mother, and the minister was into the creation narrative, and he was talking about that creation narrative in Genesis, Adam and Eve, and talking about the fall of man, and the cursing of women and all of that stuff. And I'm listening to that, and at this point I'm young, so my mother is like a god to me, and I'm hearing all of this stuff being said, and it's not registered, it's not sitting well with me. I feel like this guy is up there talking about my mama. My instincts are to go fight him, So I'm just looking at my mother, waiting for my mother to react to this, because my mama ain't no punk. Marcia is my sister. She is my neighbor, my first neighbor. Marcia knew me before I knew myself. She got a couple years on me, so we grew up together. So Marcia, no, my mama ain't no punk, right? So I'm sitting here waiting for my mother to react to what I perceive as foolishness, coming up there. But my mama did nothing. My mama just sat there and took it, just accepted that. And I'm like, something didn't feel right about that, and I never forgot that moment, So that was the moment when it first occurred to me that something was wrong with the way this society views women. The second moment that's related in response to that question speaks to a moment that occurred on a lazy winter afternoon in 2002, when it was a Sunday afternoon. I was in and out of sleep, nodding in and out with the TV on. And I'm into Think TV, right? Technology, history, animals and stuff. I happened to have a program on that day that was showing, it was a program about lion prides on the southern plains of the Serengeti. And as I nodded in and out, with this thing on, I paid enough attention to notice something that I had never noticed before, which was that the female lions was running things. And when I say running things, I mean running things. Everything. What was most significant for me in that moment was I recognized that the male lion was the king by the permission and authority of the lion queen. And when she decides he's no longer the king, he's gone. Wandering around on the savannah with a buddy or two, waiting to die. So when I recognized that, I'm like, whoa, hold on. So what I did in that moment, I did what our ancestors did. I observed nature. And nature revealed some deeper lessons about us, about me, right? So from that day forward, I'm thinking, well, what if sisters work together like that? And it didn't take me too long to realize some sisters do. You know, and then I'm thinking about the movements that we've had and, you know, what the role of women has been and all of those things and how women have sustained us in spite of the fact that we haven't done everything that we should do at every step along the way. Amen? I said amen for them. You know? So it caused me to begin this thought process that is still unfolding, you know, about women's nature and, you know, where we would be if we recognized, if we had a perspective on women that didn't suggest that they were responsible for the fall of man, that didn't suggest that they were cursed, you know, all of that stuff, right? So that revelation raised a few questions, as I'm saying. What would be the outcome if more women in general, our women in particular, would cooperate like that? What are the conditions that prevent that type of collective work and responsibility? We all know women in our personal lives who are like the female lion, don't we?
Yeah.
Of course we do. We call her Big Mama, or Grandma, or Mama, or Sister, or wife, or daughter. You know, all of those roles are reflected, right, are covered. Where that woman is fiercely devoted to family and community, fearless in the face of threats to that which she holds dear, tireless providers of that which sustains us and the world, and dignified and determined in every conceivable way. What then keeps this from being the standard by which women function and co-lead society as a whole? I argue the obvious and sometimes not so obvious answers to those questions are that women have been limited by the beliefs, ideals, values, and related practices of the culture and society we live in. Where did those beliefs, ideals, values, and sanctioned practices originate? They didn't drop out of the sky or sail in from the ocean, as Dr. Karenga says. Culture is a learned process. So I reasoned that it all began with what we believe about how the world and human life began. So I went again to the only sacred text I had considered up to that point, and I reread the creation narrative in the book of Genesis to gain insight. In doing that, I soon realized that there are two distinctly different creation narratives in Genesis. By a show of hands, who else has noticed that? There are two distinctly different creation narratives. And I encourage you all to go to your Bibles and see it. The first one begins at 1:1 and goes to 2:3. At 2:4, you have a completely new creation narrative beginning, as if the first thing never even happened. And I count the completion of that narrative all the way up to chapter 3, verse 24, when Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Our common understanding, the common understanding that has been developed about creation, is actually a composite of those two creation narratives. And the first one is referred to as the priestly narrative, and that's the older of the two. The second is referred to as the Jahwist narrative. And I trust that by Jahwist, they're making reference to a Hebrew cultural orientation, you know, Yahweh, you know, and all of that. So our common understanding is a merger of the two. In other words, to make my point clear, in spite of what we've been taught to believe, Eve was not born of Adam's rib on the sixth day. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the 7-day creation narrative is a completely separate narrative from the Adam and Eve narrative. So you don't get Eve being born on the 6th day. The woman that's born on the 6th day is not Eve in that narrative. We're going to see that. In other words, so let's read that. And I'm not going to burden y'all with reading everything. I'm not even going to burden y'all with reading all of the stuff that I put in red. The point that I'm trying to get to is the discussion about where the women, where the people where the people came in. So I'm going to quickly go through the first 5 days. You know, we got the heaven and earth being created, and then we got let's see. It says on the first day, you got the called the light day and the darkness night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And then on the second day, we got the firmament of heaven. And then on the third day, you got the grass and the herb yielding seed and the trees and the fruit and all of those things on the third day. Then on the fourth day, let's see what we got. Two great lights, it says, which was interesting to me because we know now that there's only one great light. When it says two great lights, it's referring to the sun and the moon. But the moon is a rock or a reflector. It's not a light at all. There's only one great light in the sky. And you would think that God would have known that. But, you know, I'm going to move on. Anyway, so that was the fourth day. The fifth day, you got God created whales and every living creature that moveth, with which the waters brought forth abundantly in their kind, and every winged fowl and all of that. And that was the fifth day. Then here, God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth and this kind, and it was so, right? And then here, approaching the sixth day, God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over everything upon the earth. So God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So you don't hear anything in there about Eve. But what you did hear was a perception of the divine that includes the woman in the divine equation. Did y'all see that? Because how could man and woman be created in the image of God if the image of God didn't include the woman? So you can even get a conversation about the divine nature of women out of the Bible, if you know how to read and look for it, right? But what happened is that that second narrative is what prevails over people's understanding, and we're taught to accept the bulk of the Adam and Eve narrative as the foundation of our understanding of creation. And I argue that that has been and continues to be profoundly destructive to the self-concept of women. Men's perception of women. I argue that that is at the very foundation, and it's reasonable, of the entire secondary status that women experience in this society, because God said so. Did y'all hear that? Did it ever strike anybody besides me as odd that God, the Creator, would see women in such a diminished capacity, yet and still gave women the single most important task in all creation? Don't that seem like a conflict that only a confused man could put together? The divine most certainly would be more clear in that. There's no way that women could be tasked.
That's the original oxymoron.
Hey, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Like, where did that come from? You know? So, by comparison, the first creation narrative, and I didn't have to go through that Adam and Eve thing. Y'all know that. I'm not going to take away from what is intended to be a spiritually uplifting conversation with that. You know, talking about curses and birth pains and all of that kind of foolishness.
That's right.
You know, we've heard that before, so we're not going to invoke that here. But comparing the two, we find that the first creation narrative offers a God in a plural sense with male and female principles. So God created man in his image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. It's right in there. The common understanding of creation in this society, as I mentioned, is based on a composite of the two. The notion of the 7 days comes from the first narrative. I encourage y'all to go to your Bible. When you get to chapter 2, verse 4, and that creation narrative starts all over again, you should scratch your head like I did. Like, what happened? And it's interesting how people rationalize that too. In spite of the fact that the Bible doesn't say that, as I was preparing for this conversation today and going over some material, I came upon another attempt to explain that away by saying that the first creation spoke about the creation of the heavens, and the second creation was about the creation of the earth. Now, in spite of the fact, again, that the Bible doesn't say that, that's the type of self-reasoning that people do so that they can come to terms with the contradiction. You know, they don't know what's going on there. I had a sister who I pointed that out to over at the Cultural Center, that there were two creation narratives, and she went to her Bible. She didn't believe me at first. So she went to her own Bible and saw it, and then came back the following week and said she had in fact seen it. I said, well, what do you think about it? And she said, well, the first one is like a preview of the second. I said, what do you mean a preview, sister? Like in a movie? She said, yeah. I said, wow. Wow. The depths that we go to deal with that cognitive dissonance, make that work, you know. The truth of the matter, and I don't want to get ahead of myself because I think I got this in here. The truth of the matter is that they are two distinctly different narratives that come from two distinctly different time periods and two distinctly different, cultural perspectives. A question can be asked, why did the Bible writers not do a more effective job of merging the two? But whatever their purpose was at the time, it didn't call for that. So they just blunted one right next to the other and left it there for us to figure out. The fact that it's like that is a clue for us if we're not afraid of asking these questions and getting to the bottom of things. But a lot of people are afraid to learn because they want to hold on to the faith based on what they've been taught, right? They come from two different sources. Let me see. So again, notion of 7 days comes from the first narrative. The names Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden come from the second narrative. Some of our scholars believe that Adam is derived from Atum, who is a Kemetic deity, refers to God in completeness, having both male and female principles. You see the connection? Adam, Atum. Because indeed, in order for Eve to have been created from Adam's rib, Adam had to have that female principle inside of him. Right? Of course. So women, yes sir?
I want to make a little comment about that. It just seems insane to think that the Creator would create a man and then have the woman as an afterthought. It wasn't planned that women would be here. It's just
Well, the thing of it is, brother, when you find that as odd, and then decide to study it so that you can understand it, how that happened, it becomes clear how it happened. It's because the men who wrote these books had a problem with their women, and they had a problem with what they saw in African culture. And they recognized that in order to change that, the main thing they had to do was get to these people at their spirit and give them a different narrative, give them a different interpretation of these things. So that's where we got the distortion. Woman created as an afterthought, not only after man in the second Jawa's version, but also after all of the animals.
right. Yeah.
That's significant if order of creation is a reflection of priority and importance as I interpret it to be. It would also be significant then that God spoke lovingly to Adam in that narrative, but only spoke to Eve in condemnation. Although there are clear and measurable differences between the two that clearly declares a derivative existence for women and an implied secondary status, the tide doesn't truly turn for women until the fall in Genesis 3. That's where it gets rough. You know, and again, I'm not going to repeat that, even though I have it in the presentation, because I don't want to dampen the spirit and the message today with that. We're all familiar with it, so it's not necessary anyway. But when the divine inspiration of women, when the divinity of women is recognized, good things happen, right? First, if you acknowledge the woman as a divine being, that demands honor and respect in all things. It also creates a philosophical barrier to the type of oppression and exploitation unleashed on women in this society and the world. I didn't finish that sentence there. What I was about to write was, if a society acknowledges women's divinity, you ain't gonna have sanctioned rape going on. You ain't gonna have, people turning their heads and saying, get over it. Well, what were you wearing?
Yeah.
You're not going to have that type of foolishness going on. I imagine a society where there is no debate over equality of opportunity, earnings, and the right to be present and participating fully and freely in every aspect of the society. Because of the different perspective brought forth in the female spirit, I believe there might be some actual family values reflected in the policies and practices of this society as opposed to lip service if the divinity of women was recognized and women were sitting at the table, to the degree that they should be. We would have a different society. Is that fair to say? Yeah. Of course. I believe the divine feminine would oppose war more vehemently, because women suffer more in times of war than men do. It's not only women suffer, through direct threat to their livelihood, but also women become pawns of war, and women have to suffer the pain and all of that of dealing with their children, being taken away and being sent off to die for pointless reasons, and watch their men do all that. So women suffer greatly in times of war, and I believe because of that, as we're gonna see here in a bit with Lema Boy and her work, that if women are at the table, then we wouldn't have as much war. If the divinity of women was recognized and they were cherished like they should be, we wouldn't have that. But at the same time, I know some warrior women too. So if it goes down, I know they could be called and be right there on it. I mean, hey, I said my mama ain't no punk. And she ain't. I seen my mama put a gun to somebody's head. She ain't no punk. If it was going down and I could get to her, I would want to call her because I know my mama ready to roll. We grew up in Detroit on the edge of what was called Black Bottom in the hood, So, she came ready for that. As a general rule, I would also argue, and in the spirit of today's message, I most often refer to God as she. And I'm always keenly aware of the people's reactions to that around me. And it may come as a surprise to some, but not to all, that I get the strongest opposition to the ideal of God as she from women who tell me that they only know their Lord and Savior as he. And they don't want to hear me say that. Never heard that?
I've said it, but I've never heard a woman say that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you what. Stand outside the church service. There you go. That will happen. So, just as in this society's sacred text, there are more than one creation narratives. What I said earlier was that it all is connected to Kemet, Egypt. And just as in this sacred text, where you got more than one creation narrative, you got more than one creation narrative in ancient Kemet. That's one of those things where people will dismiss a tradition because because of stuff like that. I've had people want to dismiss ancient Kemet because multiple creation narratives, multiple stories, as if you don't have that in their text. It's just that they don't understand it like that, The Hosea, which is sacred wisdom of ancient Egypt, provides a version of a narrative known as the Memphite theology. In the book of Knowing the Creations, chapter 1, titled Ra's Description of His Creation, it says this: Thus said Ra, the Lord of all, Lord of the utmost limits, after he had come into being. I don't want to read all of this, because let me go to the point I'm trying to make here, is that in this creation narrative, you have at the start, at the outset, recognition of the divinity of women. They are included in it. You have references to Ma'at. Ma'at is a female deity. It says, I created forms of every kind. Many were the forms which I issued forth from the commands of my mouth. Not yet had I established Shu. Shu is a female divinity. The power and principle of light and air. Nor sent forth Tefnut. Tefnut is another. Power and principle of moisture. There existed no one who acted together with me. I conceived it in my own heart, and there came into being a vast number of divine beings as forms of offspring and forms of their offspring from them. So there's mention of a multitude of them. This is a graphic that includes a reference to the principal deities in the creation narrative, the one that I'm referring to. And the ones that I have circled are all divine feminine. All of them are represented. Over half of the divine beings reflected are female. Over half. And certainly, there are people here at CRAS who understand this material even more than I do. Sister Simpson could come up here and break all of this down for us at the most detailed level, right? And what each one of them does and what each one of them represents and what their strengths were and their role in, maintaining order in society and all of those things. But it's powerful. No other ancient civilization reflects women in this type of a way. Having a divine feminine principle, I believe, contributed directly to ancient Egyptian society thriving for thousands of years and emerging as the greatest known civilization in antiquity and the basis for advanced civilization today. People still don't understand all of the stuff that we got from ancient Kemet. People don't understand that the 24-hour clock, 365-day calendar, those types of things, the basic things, the things that people think God created, came out of Kemet. Science, mathematics, all kinds of things. I argue that we can learn much from their example about the overall benefits of recognizing the divine balance. Unlike most other ancient cultures, women in ancient Kemet were educated, owned property, worked in most, if not all, discipline, held political offices of leadership, and occupied a central role in the temple. So what we have here, then, we can readily talk about how God called his son out of Egypt. But they don't know, if you don't know the backstory about what was significant about Egypt, those are just empty words. But when you understand the story that was behind it and why, what was so special about Egypt and what did Egypt really believe in, you get a much deeper story. So that's my discussion about the ancient Egyptian and their understanding of the role of women, the divinity of women. The Dogon people, Western Africa, they're another ancient advanced culture society. The Dogon are thought to be the direct descendants of the ancient Kemetu, having fled the Nile Valley region as a result of repeated invasions that eventually collapsed their society permanently. The Dogon possess highly advanced knowledge of the solar system and a peculiar knowledge of an invisible star called Sirius B that orbits a star called Sirius A that has been widely recognized as the brightest sky in the night star. Sirius A is that star that is central to the Three Kings narrative. The Three Kings narrative, where you have the three kings who follow is it the Eastern Star? I think it's the Eastern Star, to the birthplace of Christ. That is situated in a constellation called Orion's Belt, And the magic behind it is it appears every year at the end of the year in the southern sky. You can go out and see it at 9 o'clock at night. You can see it crystal clear, Marcia. And what happens is you have 3 stars in Orion's belt that align in a perfect line on December 25th, in a perfect line with the Sirius A star. And that line points directly to the spot on the horizon where the sun is going to rise the next morning. That's the 3 kings following the Eastern Star to the birth of Christ. And you can see it every year. Matter of fact, if you're interested, because we're not too far removed from it, you can go out in the sky tonight and look up in the south towards southwest sky, about 9 o'clock. Look overhead. You're going to see a distinct set of 3 stars. And they're going to be pointing towards a very bright star. It's not going to be in a perfect alignment now, but it's going to be in close enough alignment where you're going to be able to see it. And then next year, around December 25th, make a point to go out at night when the sky is clear and mark those 3 stars pointing in a direct line to that one bright star and note where it's pointing to on the horizon. And then come out the next morning and see where the sun rises from. There's your 3 kings. So the Dogon had extensive knowledge of the Sirius star system. They even claim that that's where human beings came from. When European scientists visited the Dogon to gain access to the knowledge they were rumored to possess, they left insisting that the Dogon most assuredly had previously spoken to a European scholar, because there was no way they could possess this knowledge otherwise. Science had not been developed enough for us to have a telescope, they thought, so that they could see that.
They couldn't see it.
So how could they possibly know it? The Dogon cosmology teaches that human beings came to Earth from Sirius B. Sirius B, again, is a star so faint that you can't see it, that orbits that bright star. That's where they say human beings came from. Consistent with their advanced knowledge, the Dogon have a complicated creation narrative that, when objectively considered, sounds a whole lot like the Big Bang Theory, quantum physics, or string theory. I'm serious. It's more than a notion to wrap your mind around the creation as they described it. But when you do, and you understand it, and you're familiar with the Big Bang, it sounds a lot alike. You know, talking about everything emerging out of a single seed, minuscule size, infinitesimal size, everything. That's what it said. The interesting part of their creation narrative that I'm going to focus on today as it relates to our topic is reflected in their teachings on the creation of woman and man. On that question, the Dogon teach that, and I quote, women and men had to be created at the exact same time, because if not, the ache from the absence of one would have killed the other. Say that again.
Yeah.
Women and men had to be created at the exact same time, because if not, the ache from the absence of one would have killed the other. I told y'all, if the Creator should take women off of here, me and this brother and that brother and this brother and that little brother and all of the other brothers, we're going to line ourselves up. And we going to the nearest cliff.
Not only that, we have bodies that are anatomically compatible.
Exactly.
It's like a separation occurred between the two.
Hey, I can't take
Created
it.
the field.
I can't even take the thought. I got to stop talking about it. Right?
Great.
I got to stop talking about it. So that's what I wanted to talk about in the Dogon tradition, because that's a completely different conversation than talking about the woman being created as an afterthought after the lizards and the mice
Roaches.
and the roaches. You know, that establishes a completely different orientation and significance We had to be created at the same time. Now, I personally believe, and I think my son agrees with me, he said something to this effect. Women came first.
They did.
I mean, how could they not?
Yeah, they did. They did.
I mean, we could have a conversation about that, but I'm going to maintain that until somebody proves me otherwise. You know, that works best with my spirit.
I can
You know?
prove you. If the man was created first, he would die, and no other person on earth would live.
That's right.
One person dead, no other.
That's right. That's right. That's right. We doing our best with this one. We doing our best with this one. I'm gonna move on then to another tradition. The Yoruba, Ifa. The Ifa tradition of the Yoruba people of Western Africa. That's another ancient tradition. And they got some teachings for you on this topic. Divinity of women. And again, I'm going to deal with creation stories because, I believe that lays the foundation for the entire society, the entire culture. The Yoruba people have long been one of the largest cultural groups on the continent. They occupy regions of the continent that were ravaged by the Holocaust of enslavement. What that means in a practical sense is that if all of us in this room could trace our lineage back to the continent, a measurable percentage of us would find ourselves to be Yoruba. And the Ifa tradition would be our original moral, ethical, and spiritual tradition. Ifa is the only indigenous spiritual tradition that has survived and thrived outside of the continent up to the present. It is one of a few that has a sustained history and sacred narratives that remain intact, with new related works continuing to come into existence. There's a reason why the spiritual traditions, many of the spiritual traditions have been lost. And that reason is deliberate act. The conquerors came in and recognized that destroying and redirecting the spiritual understanding of the people was key. The Romans, they picked this up from the Greeks. Their mission wasn't just to conquer the people, but to also conquer the people's gods. Because once they've conquered the people's gods, they now have the capacity to manipulate the spirit of the people in any way they choose, which is precisely what they have done.
But there was a period, though, that the Romans are actually worshiping African deity, such as the Black Madonna and Child.
Indeed.
So they picked up on that concept, digested to a certain degree, but then there were certain elements they couldn't totally.
Indeed, what history teaches us, history implies, this may be more of an opinion than objective fact, objective truth. History teaches us that they took their time about their conquest. You know, they came in and warmed things up, you know, made friends, you know, embraced the culture. Yeah. And all of those things, and caused the people to put their guard down, you know, before they then, you know, revealed a broader mission, you know. So that was part of it, you know. And you can still find to this day, but they're in the process of changing those things, brother. They're over there right now, changing the color of some of the imagery.
Oh, for sure.
You know.
That's why the access is so restricted.
Yeah. Yeah, they are up to it. So they most certainly did embrace African deities. They know. I mean, if you could get the Pope to have a real conversation with you, he would tell you that all they're doing is trying their best to replicate the spiritual tradition coming out of Kemet.
Yeah. They didn't say anything in China. China, when they discovered their pyramids, they built forests over them, cover them up.
Yeah, yeah. So moving on, again, let me see, where was I at? And even offer perspective on the role. Okay, the Ifa tradition, at several places in the sacred text. And again, Ifa, chapter 5, again, introduces Ifa here. I'm quoting from the Odu Ifa, which is a complete sacred text out of there. Although it focuses on the ethical teachings, not some of the more esoteric, you know, divination rituals and stuff like that. It focuses on the ethical teachings, and there are several ethical teachings within the Odu Ifa that deal with the role of women. And one of the things that I appreciate about the sacred text that emerged out of this book is that when Dr. Karenga made the translations, he didn't do the translations from other translations. He went to the original source text. And where it was necessary, he learned the languages. He learned how to read the Medu Neter so that he didn't have to do a translation from one of the Europeans. He did a direct translation from the Medu Neter, or what some people call hieroglyphs. When he did the translation of the Yoruba, he learned how to speak Yoruba so that he could go to the original text, not from some other English translation, right? One of the ones that I appreciate most is Odu Ifa 10.2. Let me see. There are two of them that I'm going to discuss here before I get ready to close. 10.2 is a very interesting one. Let me see. Yeah. This one is dealing with a creation narrative. So I'll just read through it and discuss it on the other side. Odu Ifa 10.2, it says, this is a teaching of Ifa for Odu. Obarisa and Ogun, they were divine beings. They were coming from heaven to earth. Odu asked, O Olodumare, that's their name for God. O God, Lord of heaven, this earth where we are going, what will happen when we arrive there? Olodumare said they were going to make the world so that the world will be good. He also said that everything that they were going to do there, he would give them the ashe, which means divine power and authority, to accomplish it so that it will be done well. Odu says, O Olodumare, on this earth where we are going, Ogun has the power to wage war, and Obarisa has the ashe to do anything he wishes to do. What is my power? In this instance, Odu is a female divinity, where Ogun and Obarisa are male divinities. Now it's significant, again, to consider the numbers. In this creation narrative, two male divinities were sent with one female. That says something about scope and scale, and capacities, right? So the woman, the female divinity is then asking, pointing out that Obarisa, Ogun has the power to wage war, and Obarisa has the ashe to do anything he wishes to do. What is my power? Odu asked Olodumare, or asked God. God says, you will be their mother forever, and you will also sustain the world. Olodumare then gave her the power, and when he gave her the power, he gave her the spirit power of the bird. And that's a significant reference in the culture for the power that she represents. It was then that he gave women the power and authority so that anything men wish to do, they could not dare to do it successfully without women. Odu said that everything that people will want to do, if they do not include women, it will not be possible. Ashe. If that's not a reflection of the world that we live in, and the unmitigated truth, unadulterated, undeformed truth, I don't know what is. But in this society, we don't live with that understanding because we grounded in that other narrative, right? So let me move on. Let me see, to wrap this one up, it said, Obarisa said that people should always respect women greatly. For if they always respect women greatly, the world will be in right order. Has a lot to do with the fact that why the world is in wrong order right now. Pay homage then, give respect to women. Indeed, it is a woman who brought us into being before we became recognized as human beings. The wisdom of the world belongs to women. Give respect to women then. Indeed, it is a woman who brought us into being before we became recognized as human beings. In chapter 78:1 of the Odu Ifa, it doesn't speak exclusively about women, but it is such a beautiful and poignant teaching. After you hear it, I think you'll understand why I'm compelled to share it, why I'm compelled to share it. It reads like this. It says, let us do things with joy, for surely humans have been chosen to bring good into the world. The all-knowing one, priest of Orunmila, interpreted the teachings of Ifa for Orunmila. In this tradition, Orunmila is sort of like what Jesus is to God in the Christian narrative. The messenger, the voice, the personification in that instance. He said, the people of the world will come to ask him a certain question. Then one day, all kinds of people, good people and those who do not allow good in other people's lives, gathered together. They then went to Orunmila. They said, coming back and forth to earth tires us, Orunmila. Therefore, please allow us to rest in heaven. Orunmila said, you cannot avoid going back and forth to earth until you bring about the good condition that Oludumare has ordained for every human being. After that, and only after that, may you rest in heaven. They asked, what is the good condition then? Orunmila said, the good condition is a good world, a world which there is full knowledge of all things, happiness everywhere, life without fear or anxiety of enemies, life without bogus viruses or real viruses manufactured to scare the daylights out of you, that type of thing. Without clashes with snakes or other dangerous animals, without fear of death, disease, litigation, losses, wizards, witches, or Eshu, without fear of injury from water or fire, and without fear of poverty or misery. The things needed to bring about the good condition in the world, then, are wisdom that is fully adequate to govern the world, sacrifice, character, the love of doing good for all people, especially those who are in need and those who seek assistance from us, and the eagerness to struggle to increase good in the world and not let any good at all be lost. People will continue to go to heaven, and they will go back and forth to earth after their transfiguration until everyone has achieved the good condition. Those chosen to bring good into the world are called human beings, or the chosen ones. That's an interesting narrative, not only because it couples with the other narratives to talk about not only the divine role of women, but the chosen status of humans as a whole. But unlike the other conversation about chosen status that we're most familiar with, it doesn't talk about one people being chosen over and above other people. It talks about all people being chosen, and our purpose and obligation in that chosenness is the task of bringing good into the world, not the task of conquering for domination's sake. That one chosen, so-called chosen group of people right now will never let you forget that they've been oppressed. But they clearly didn't learn substantive lessons from that oppression, because right now they are the greatest, one of the greatest oppressors on earth, oppressing the Palestinian people. They're, and the interesting about it is that religious people go along with this in spite of the fact that the people that they are oppressing are the people of Jesus. Right? Wasn't Jesus a Palestinian Jew? You got these chosen people now over there ravaging Jesus' chosen people. And because they don't understand the history and the tradition and the twists and turns of it, they right there going along with it. Because they're being led. They haven't been inspired. Certainly not inspired to look within themselves and find the best version and pull it out. They've been led to follow, and that's what they do. So, to summarize then, we all know that the world is history, and our history in particular have been ravaged. Our people and the society we live in are in a purposeful state of confusion because of it. Thank you. In this presentation, I advance a broadly held belief that reconnecting with the best of our once lost cultural traditions is the first step to recover ourselves and help improve the world in the process. Central to that thesis is my belief, shared by others, that women must be restored to their rightful divine status as a primary component of that effort. I say primary, meaning first. If we're going to get started, we got to start there. If we don't start there, we ain't going nowhere. That's the simple fact of the matter. We can keep trying other things and hoping for a different outcome, but it ain't going to work out for us. Because it's already been written. It's already in the history books. It's already all around us for us to see it if we would open our eyes. We ain't getting there no other way, y'all. We ain't getting there no other way. I argue that the natural balance will only be restored in our community and beyond when women fully recognize and embrace their divinity and demand the same from others. It is in this way that the world will change when women decide the world will change. For as Mary McLeod Bethune taught us, if you want to measure the character of a people, culture, or society, take a look at the status of its women. Mother Bethune also shared another teaching that I've adopted and I shared earlier. Next to God, we are indebted to women. First for life itself, and then for making it worth living. Y'all know that's the truth. You know how your life has been shaped and influenced by the women, beginning with your life coming from a woman? This is not rocket science. Children know this. That's why children look at their mother with eyes like she's God, because they know they haven't been separated from that yet. We all need to remember that. So in conclusion, the question becomes, what then is my responsibility as a man as it concerns the divine nature of women? First, I must recognize my own divinity. I must recognize that I'm a divine being. Because if we listen to what our conquerors have taught us, if we stay grounded in that, it's so easy to lose sight of that because our oppressors don't walk the world as divine beings. They walk the world as maligners and marauders and murderers, robbers and pillagers and rapists, And because some of us have been influenced by that, we act the same way that they do. There's so many of us, we running around like this, trying to get our hands on every piece of woman that we can just for the sake of getting our hands on her. We don't want nothing with her. We want to use her and discard her. Some of our women have aligned themselves. Too many of our women have aligned themselves with that thinking, and they don't see any higher value in themselves than what they're able to shake and show and twist. But as a man, my first obligation is to recognize my own divinity. Because if I recognize my own divinity, then that positions me to recognize the divinity in others. If I'm truly walking as a divine man, I can't help but see the divinity in women. Right? The divinity in me must recognize the divinity in women. Number two. Number three, because of my divinity, I must not exploit the women who don't recognize their own divinity. And I must limit my association with them to helping them recognize their divinity. I don't know if y'all can read between the lines of that statement, so let me make it plain. Let me make it plain. And I gotta, be mindful of my children. I am a divine being. I have a temple. This is my temple. This temple is as sacred as any other temple on earth. And most certainly, a woman's body is a temple. It's where life is created. That's a temple. But mine is a temple too. And we're taught to forget that by imitating conquerors and behaviors. My phallus is a divine phallus. You see what I'm saying? Which in order for me to be willing to share, it requires more than just her willingness. She has to match my divinity. Otherwise, that exchange is going to diminish me in some way, shape, or form, in ways that I might not even be able to anticipate, because who knows what's going to happen after the fact. All types of craziness can happen. You have people wandering around your job, throwing rocks and bricks through your windows. Ain't no telling, ain't nothing free. We we've seen it happen, right? I've been there after the fact, like, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? Number 4, more specifically, I must engage all women as either a mother to me, a sister to me, a daughter to me, or a wife. That's what our traditions taught. You got to treat all women as either a mother, a sister, a daughter, a wife. That doesn't mean that we can't be friends, but it means that my understanding of her as a friend is secondary to my understanding of her as a mother, sister, daughter, or wife. Also, number 5, and this is where it starts to get thick. I got to be willing to check and challenge other men who either don't recognize their own divinity or that of women, and encourage them to recognize both. I got to check and challenge them guys who, want to tell me them player stories, about all of the women that they ran through and all of that stuff. Brother, that don't mean nothing to me. What did you get out of that? What did you leave her with? And what is that going? Where you going with that? How does that build community? Those type of things. And finally, I must encourage all women to recognize their divine status and to encourage the same in every woman they meet. These are my roles. This is my responsibility as a man as it concerns the divine inspiration of women. So with that, I say Hotep, Ashe, Hedi Amen, which is literally translates to mean peace, divine power, and many blessings. May the hidden one hear my plea. Ashe. Now, because I mentioned that this was a preview of a paper I was going to present, and the conference got canceled, so I'm not going to have the opportunity to present the paper. This was a discussion about the divinity of women and framing it. The paper was going to be a discussion about the good things that happen when a society is grounded, when women are grounded broadly in an understanding of their divinity and the related capacities of it. And I was going to use examples like the Me Too movement. I was going to use Lama Bowie and the women's movement of Liberia, as a modern day example of things that happen, good things that happen when women are working and operating from a perspective of understanding their divinity. So what I want to do is I want to close with a short video that features Lama Bowie, she's speaking about her work, and this was done in Oslo, so it was around the time when she won the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. It also includes a trailer for a movie that tells the story of the movement that she started, that she led. And that's a film that's worth screening here at Carras. And if it's not screened at Carras at some point, it most certainly is worth you making note of it and watching it in your own space. It's a film called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. So there's about a 15-minute clip I'm going to close with that includes that trailer. And then it includes words from Lama Bowie, that I want you all to hear. And then I'll come back for a question and answer period after that, okay? And I was going to just snatch this clip and put it in my presentation, but you can't readily download videos from YouTube anymore. And I'm thankful that Brother Abid was able to hook it up for me so that it's all is well, all the same.
I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for bringing me here
That's
to
a
Oslo,
beautiful sister right there.
and to thank the Norwegian people for the warm welcome. Every time I come to Norway, I'm physically challenged. In 2008, I was 3 months pregnant and we're promoting a film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell. Came to one of the theaters here, and after the movie, they put bar stools up for us to sit. Imagine a fat 3 months pregnant African woman trying to climb a bar stool. What I heard from the audience was that, well, at least we know that while she was protesting, she wasn't visiting bars because I could not climb. When Justine was presenting and she did that thing down there, I said, please don't, because it would take 2 very strong men to lift me up if I tried it. The road to freedom is long. The cost of freedom is high. The fight for freedom is not for the faint-hearted and the pessimist.
And this is
Money,
the trailer for the film.
greed, ethnicity, absolute power. There is nothing that should make people do what they did to the children of Liberia. The warlords who gave these boys guns and sent them off. They just do anything because they had guns. You go to bed saying, God, please. What do we do? I had a dream, and it was like a crazy dream. We decided to protest. We wore the white, saying to people we were out for peace. Thousands of women, Muslim and Christian, were coming together calling for peace. These women had seen the worst, but they still had that vibrance for life. And we said, well, if I should get killed, just remember me that I was fighting for peace. We stepped out first and did the unimaginable. To send out a signal to the world that we, the Liberian women, are tired of the killing of our people. We can do it again if we want to. I want to hear now, gratefully acknowledge the powerful voice of women. Liberia is a country that has been in conflict with itself from its formation. Our history is distorted. It starts from 1821 at the arrival of the free slaves, leaving out the indigenous people who came.
That's right.
In 1980, we got a President Doe who came, took over, and executed, quote unquote, the American Liberians publicly. 13 very powerful men put on the poles and executed. 1989, Charles Taylor was then the spokesperson for the rebel group. He terrorized and killed half of his colleagues and later on became the leader. The impact of this war, 200,000 deaths, 1 million internally displaced, 500,000 refugees, devastating destruction on the country's infrastructure. To date, we're just seeing electricity and running waters in tiny pots. We had a total breakdown in traditional and moral values. These are some of the images of the war. The story of the Liberian women. When the stories of Liberian women are told, it will be told in 2 parts. Women as victims and fighters, the traditional stories of rape and violent abuse, mutilation, gross humiliation, and disempowerment of women. And the second part of the story, and that's the part of the story I'm here to tell, the women's victory over the callous display of patriarchy, political violence. In 2003, fed up with the war, fed up with boy soldiers putting their hands in our underclothes, searching for what they said was guns and pistols and reconnaissance notes, fed up with our daughters being taken away from us to warm the beds of some drug emboldened fighter, fed up with our sons being recruited into militias, fed up with the rhetorics of Taylor, a group of community women gathered together and decided enough is enough. For us, the price of sitting was getting higher than the price of getting involved. We had been pushed so far back that we had two options: accept the death that was imminent or fight back and leave a legacy. We boldly decided to step out. Daily, we protested major embassies, sit-ins, picketing, press releases, letters and opinions to the international community were all features of what we did. In desperation, we added this extract. Some Liberians will say every morning when we went out, all those women have swallowed the madness pill, because mad people we really look like. But for us, the death of our children, the pains that we were enduring, was something that we could not sit and wait and listen to. In 2003, we went to a peace talks in Accra, Ghana, that we thought would last for 2 weeks. The talks lasted for 3 months. One morning, we woke up and there was this news flash on the internet that a missile had landed in the American embassy compound where internally displaced people were. Mad, angry, crazy, I went into the peace hall, told the women lock arms, we're keeping those men in there, no food, no water, and this is the image of the barricading of the hall at the peace talks. The security forces came and said they were arresting me. I told them I'll make it very easy for you. I'll strip naked. They left me immediately. Some people ask, what is it about a woman stripping naked that makes people run, or even makes the conscience of a group of men who have paid and drugged boys to rape these same women to wake up? The thing is, when you're raped in conflict, when you're stripped naked in conflict, it's against your will. When a group of women or a group of people get to the place where they've decided, I'm going to give you the last shred of my dignity, that's something to wake anyone up, even the most heartless dictator. A peace agreement was signed 3 weeks after this action. We continue to do what we thought, because in our opinion as women, the victory of peace and security at the time seemed sensational, but to us it was still insignificant. We decided a peace agreement did not guarantee peace. We continued working, disarming fighters, carrying out sensitization, civic rights and responsibility, encouraging community women, some of whom in their entire lives had never gone out to vote, to get out to vote. The story, in 2005, we got Africa's first elected female president. Is that the end? Was that the end of everything for us? No. We decided, yes, we've won the war, but the fight is on. We started to tackle some of those things within our law. Today, Liberia has one of the strongest laws on rape. It's 12 to life. We have an inheritance law for women who married in traditional marriages, who initially could not inherit any of their husband's property. What are some of the current realities? Rape is high. Abuse and exploitations of girls in school, sex for grades, is even higher. Teen prostitution and alcoholism is something that we're dealing with. Harmful traditional practices exist, but they are swept under the carpet. Today in Liberia, maternal mortality is 994 to every 100,000 births. The women movement continues to advocate for women's rights, and some gains has been made, as I talked about. But our struggle, like I said initially, is far from over. What are we doing currently? We're working with girls in communities to see how they can tackle some of the issues that they are faced with. We do awareness, community-based initiative around education, and I agree with a lot of the speakers that a nation can never progress from where it finds itself unless education is prioritized. and the state of the girls in Liberia is something that is worrisome to us. How do you have a nation that broke history by giving Africa her first female president 20 years down the road? There is not a whole set of women's leadership to show that we've mentored our girls, we've encouraged them to go out there. So currently, this is the kind of work that we're doing. But one of the other things that we're doing as part of the work, as part of the women's movement, is that when Ellen was elected, we told ourselves, a female president doesn't guarantee a lot of things. And as women, the way we will sit or the way we will make this government accountable to its people will guarantee the number of women that will be elected again and again. So one of my ingenious ideas was having a peer review with the president of Liberia in the women's movement on a periodic basis. It hit a glitch the first time we tried, bureaucracy and all kinds of things. Last year, I managed to meet with President Sirleaf and said to her, this is an idea that I have. She read through it, looked at me and said, Lima, I like it. So in August, we did the first peer review of the presidency, and I think this is the first time in the history of Africa that a president has opened herself for criticism. She sat down with over 100 women, and we had 5 on her national agenda up on the board and say, we want to give you your grades as women as it relates to this. Trust me, it wasn't patronizing. Trust me, we weren't singing political slogans. We were telling her, in this area you scored, in this area you failed, in this area you failed us as women, and we think you need to do better. She told me, see me in my office tomorrow. And then I said to myself, oh Lima, you're so going to prison. Oh, you're so in trouble. The next day I went to President Sirleaf's office, sat down, and she looked over her papers. You know the way the politicians know how to intimidate people. For the first time I was intimidated, chewing my nails and stomping my feet. Finally she lifted her head and said, I loved it. I want to do more. We've done 2 more, and she continues to do those peer review around the country as she goes. But this is our way of saying, though we elected you, though we celebrate your victory, but we cannot just let your victory pass without telling you what you need to do better for this country. We've also taken our peace movement across the border. Quite recently, we were in Abuja, Nigeria, protesting the war in Cote d'Ivoire. One of the things that I must say is that every year, as part of the work that we do, we look at countries in West Africa and say to ourselves, where is this one going? We have a gathering of West African women go into this country. In 2009, we were in Cote d'Ivoire. We had contacted some of the biggest international media to capture what we were saying as women at this conference. We were actually hosted by the wife of President Gbagbo. As we're at that conference, unfortunately, CNN was featuring the witches of Africa. This is how important women issues are to the global media. So we're really, really disappointed, but everything we said at that meeting came to pass in December, unfortunately, of 2010, and we saw the fall of President Gbagbo and the violence that erupted. So we've continued to make our mark. We've continued to move from borders to borders, from countries to countries in our region, trying to translate the gains that we've made in Liberia into gains for some of our sisters in countries where the women's movement are not very strong, and the women's movement still need a bit of work. Wars are not over when peace agreements have been signed, and this is something that we know in Liberia. Injustices are not over when dictators step down. Discrimination is far from over when laws and policies are enacted. Peace and freedom will only come knocking on your door with continuous engagement. To our sisters in Tunisia, Egypt, and all of the countries that have just seen some of the greatest revolution of the people's power, don't think that the people's power is going to translate into women's power. You have to step up, keep involved, keep protesting, start your own protests in the Tahrir squares and all of the different places, because the men, unfortunately, that you join side by side to protest with will beat you down if you don't stand up. For us, the women of Liberia, like I said earlier, the war is over. We won the war. The fight is on. Female president or not, we will ensure that not just Liberia move to that place of peace and sustainable development, but that we hold our leaders in the sub-region accountable in everything that they do. Thank you for having me.
Ain't that sister something?
What year was this that she did the speech?
This was 2011. Yeah.
Year before.
Is the woman still president?
No.
I don't know if Ellis Hurley Johnson is still the president. No, she's not. But I mean, y'all see why I'm a big old fan of Lema Bowie. I love that sister. I love to hear her talk. Her strength just jumps off the screen. You know, I'm serious. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we move on. I wanna. Do we have a collection basket that we can pass? I like to take up a collection of love donations for the center here because lights don't pay for themselves, buildings don't pay for themselves, and we need a space to gather to have these types of conversations, but we have to be willing to support them, right? Financially. Love can't be sent in the form of a check to cover the lights. You know we got love, but we need some finances to go along with that because that's what it takes to keep the lights on, to keep this building. Y'all know real estate in Los Angeles ain't free. You know, we not sitting on this corner on 78th and Western without, having to come out of pocket. Ain't that right, Rev? All right. So we need to be able to make a donation to support this work here. And as I said, Sister Sims said, I'll make sure that we hit the number that we need to hit.
Okay.
All right?
What's that? What's that number?
She giving me a number for the room, and I'm not burdened by it,
I'm not either. That's all.
Okay, yeah. I'll talk.
All right, bro.
Let me know too,
Say again?
Let me know too,
Okay,
if you reach that.
okay. I'm just thankful that we had the opportunity to come together, so I want to take the opportunity to give y'all a hand for thinking that this topic was worthy of your time today. Because if you believe like I do, then getting our heads right around this is the key to everything that we want to do. So hold on, I got something for the basket. I got something for the basket.
I'm just happy that our these conversations sparked this whole.
Oh yeah, I told them about you before you came in. Where did we run into each other? I
Us
couldn't.
organization.
It was over there. Okay.
During the Kwanzaa.
Yeah. Me and Sister Teddy Sherry used to come to our study group down in Long Beach, and we ran into each other, as I mentioned, up in. She said it was over at the Cultural Center, and Sister Teddy Sherry said, "Well, we got to get you over to Carras." And I was like, "Yeah, sis, I want to get over there. We live so far out now that it's like a whole day trip to come down. So I don't get to come down as often as I want." And she said, "Well, I ain't talking about you coming to visit. I'm talking about you coming to present." It's like, oh, well, that's different. Certainly talk about that. And then we had a couple real good conversations where we were trying to decide what to talk about. I said I wanted to go deeper than I have before. I don't want to just pull, any topic out, because when I come over here, I know that there's a certain level in the room, right? So I don't have to bring. What I can do is bring my best over here. I can go as deep as I possibly can here. So we started talking about what we need to talk about amongst ourselves, and I said, well, I think to me, we need to bridge the gap, because if I could go over to Crass and I could do a wonderful presentation, like Aswar Kwesi comes in and does outstanding presentations. But if it's only us here, then we got a case of preaching to the choir. All of that wonderful information is just being continuously cycled through the same ears. And in order for it to have the impact that we needed to have, we need to get some other people here. So what me and Teddy Sherry talked about was strategies for reaching other black people? How do we engage them? How do we meet them where they are to build on what they know? You know, and we agreed that if you're talking about reaching black people, you got to be able to reach them through this. And if you can't reach them through this, then it's incumbent upon you to figure out how to. You know, and I didn't know that lesson. I didn't know that lesson until a sister told me. Because I was like so many other people who come into this knowledge through our own study. I was angry at this book and everything that it represents, because I felt like I had been duped and cheated and lied to, and our ancestors were, and it's just, you know, that kind of thing. So as I came into my knowledge, I used to, and I found that other people, family members, friends, weren't interested. When I went to them all excited to tell them about something new I had learned, you know, they weren't interested. Why are you into all of that Africa stuff? You know, that's what I got from them. And I ran into this sister up in Minnesota. She was from the Caribbean. And she was happy to meet a brother who was independent-minded. You know, the Caribbeans got that in them. They got a fire. You know, some of our greatest resistors and scholars come out of the Caribbean. You know, they stayed closer connected to the culture. So I met this sister up there, and like I used to say sometimes in my study group, I was still in that mode where I was still angry, right? So I'm sitting over dinner with her, and I'm telling her about my weekend and evening job. I told her on evenings and weekends, I got a part-time job. I kick Christians. Not literally, but figuratively, with knowledge. I beat them up with what they don't know, and what more specifically with what they're not interested in knowing. You know, I would set them up with a couple questions. And then when they responded without an interest in knowing the answer, well then I would just start moving in on them. And then before it was over, I was throwing blows, uppercuts, roundhouses. I was kicking them. I was stomping them in the head with the knowledge. It was my intent to have them walk away from that conversation feeling like they had been in a fight, because I was angry at them for not wanting to know. Because wanting to know is the key to knowing, right? So I'm sitting across, and while I'm going through all of my boastful bragging about how I injure people, you know, the sister is just sitting there with her beautiful self, and she looked at me and she let me do all of my bragging and all of that. And then she said, well, brother, you do realize that whether that stuff is true or not, those are very real people, and it's very real to them. And once you take that away from them, you have an obligation to replace it with something. And I pause like this because that's what I did with her. I immediately recognized the truth in what she was saying. And it was one of the rare occasions, y'all might be able to see this, where I was speechless. I couldn't say a word. All I could do was look at it. And the funny thing about it, it occurred to me afterwards. I'm sure that somebody else has tried to tell me that. Because I had been kicking people for a while, and I've been bragging about it. And I'm sure other people had tried to tell me, stop doing that. You know, but it took that fine sister. It took me to be locked in on all of that beauty sitting across the table from me. That was the only way I heard it. That was the only way I heard it. And then because I didn't get the accolades from her, I recognized, oh man, well, if I'm trying to get at her, I got to go differently. She deeper than that. Oh man, I got some studying to do. So that was when I went back and picked this book up. Because I realized that if I'm going to meet them where they are to build on what they know, I got to know this better than they do. And I got to be able to use this to get them to this. Because they ain't interested in this until I apply what I know. I mean, we take the attitude that they need to wake up. But that's only because we're not fully grounding ourselves in an applied understanding of what we've learned. We can have a long discussion here at Coraz Unity Center about the original meaning of the Christ concept, the Coraz concept, and how that was about self-mastery. You know, that's what it was all about, self-mastery. But when we take the attitude that the people who don't know what we need to know need to wake up, as opposed to acknowledging that it's incumbent upon us to reach them with what we know and what they don't know, then, you know, we're not moving towards that self-mastery. Because when you get self-mastered, you go beyond that ego and that anger and all of those things. You know what I mean? You recognize that, you know, the most important things are relationships, right? So before you can teach somebody anything, you got to have the appropriate relationship with them. As we learned through Dr. Karanga's teachings in Kawaida, he says, you got to put the person before the point, whatever the point may be. Because you can always miss the point, and if you keep the person, you can make the point later. But if you lose the person, you will never be able to make the point. And that had me thinking about all of them people that I left bloodied and bruised and injured. You know? Yo! Some of them still not talking to me. Still going the opposite direction. Still think I'm the devil. You know? Because of stuff that I did 15 years ago. You know? But I'm not in that space anymore because I realized that while that was a temporary satisfaction to my ego, it was wholly ineffective for the work that we're supposed to be doing. Right? If we know, it's our obligation to teach. If we say we care about those people, right? So that's what this conversation was about. This conversation is really a setup for next month's, because next month is the one that I really was trying to get to. You know, a discussion about linking the ancient Coraz with the modern Christ in dialogue with black people. You know, we should be able to do that. We have to do that. There are challenges involved in that, but there are tremendous benefits if we can navigate a path that gets us there. And if we want to talk about unity in the community and amongst our people, we got to go that route. There's no other way, you know, because the truth of the matter is, black people, based on their current understanding, ain't separating from Jesus no time soon. So if you want to reach them in the most constructive ways, well, you got to find a way to connect with them where they are, right? So that's what next month's conversation is about, and what this conversation was sort of a setup for. So with all of that being said, I want to have some discussion with y'all. This wasn't just about me standing up here talking. This was about us having a dialogue, having a discussion. I want some critical feedback. It's nice to hear people say, Shujaa, I like what I heard you say. It's more meaningful to me to say, I like that except for this. And then get some critical feedback that then causes me to go back to the drawing board and dig deeper. Because I move closer to self-mastery with that, right? So that's what I look for. You know, if you don't have any critical comments, then that's okay too. You know, but I'm about the business of trying to develop myself to be the best possible version of myself. Because I want everybody who I come into contact with to do the exact same thing. So we help each other get there like that. So let's have some discussion. Sister Teddy, share.
Just a comment, not necessarily criticism at all. When my grandmother was alive, she transitioned 3 years ago now, 2.5 years ago. When I first started coming here, she would always ask me, what is that church about? And so I explained to her. I would bring her the pamphlets, the Sunday programs. And she said, oh, this is good information, but I don't see Jesus in here anywhere.
Yeah.
She would always say that. I would invite her to stuff, she wouldn't come. She loved her some Mary Kara, but this was just not her thing. When she transitioned, and I'm pinning out, you know, she saved every one of those booklets or the Sunday, and they had been leafed through. I could tell she read through them, but her indoctrination of COGIC was so hard that she was married to a minister. She was a preacher's wife. That's all we ever knew. She couldn't let that go.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, because you said you were bad, you had to stop it with something. What do you present to those hardcores to have them at least even begin to see that there is some alternative?
Well, I
And
appreciate.
maybe alternative isn't the word either.
Well, right. I appreciate what you've asked, if I understand correctly. That's an excellent question, and it gets right to the heart of the matter. What I have found to be effective is, once again, meeting the people where they are to build on what they know. They don't have any problem with a conversation about Christ. You know, you can have first thing that I do is engage them in a discussion about the creation narratives. By engaging them in a discussion about the creation narratives, they are fairly quickly able to see that there is something deeper here than what you've seen. I'm able to show them that there are two creation narratives there. You haven't been taught that, but all you have to do is look with your own eyes and you see it. And then I try to engage them in a conversation about the different ways they're taught to disregard the fact that there are two. And then I encourage them to do their own research on the history of the two, so that you can see that it's not a preview of a movie, you know. It's not one creation for heaven, one creation of earth. Look into where it came from. I encourage that. If I have success there, first thing, it's a very measured approach. You know, what I learned is that I have to allow them to lead the way towards wherever we're going. I have to allow them to lead the way based on what their comfort level is, you know, based on their strategy. So I do a range of things, like, you know, engage in conversation about the creation narrative. I'll make sure that they hear me refer to God as she. I want to see how they're going to respond to that, because their response creates an opportunity for another conversation. Wherever possible, I litter them with questions as opposed to making statements. I ask them questions. Like, which Bible version do you use? And what I'm always most excited to hear is the King James Version. Because the King James Version allows a broad-based historical discussion that is able to be pinpointed to their heart and then raise their consciousness and an understanding of their need to look deeper at this tradition. What do I mean by that? What I mean is what I learned about who King James was. I don't readily give them this. I always ask them, you know, have you ever asked yourself who is King James? And more often than not, no, I've never even thought about that. I just accepted it, didn't even think about it. You know, well, is that a question? Remembering again that it's better to ask them questions than to make statements. Well, don't you think that's a question that's worth asking, that we should know the answer to? Shouldn't I be able to get that answered in church? And invariably, the answer is always yes. Well, do you know who King James is? No, I've never even thought about it. Well, would you like to know? You can look it up yourself, you know, but if you want me to share, I'll share. I'm not going to share unless you want me to, you know. And then, you know, sometimes it's, well, no, I don't want to know. I'm not ready yet. You know, because why? They're afraid that I'm going to say something to them that is going to disturb their faith. They don't want to learn things that's going to disturb this sense of security, even if it's a false sense of security. It's all they have, it's all they know. So I got to respect that. If they say I'm not interested, I got to back up. If they say they are interested, I got to tread lightly, because that could change at the end of any sentence, right? So I tread slowly. But where King James is concerned, I learned that King James is from the same line as Prince Charles and Lady Di. Interesting. He was the king of England. He was the king of Scotland and Ireland. He actually became the king of Scotland at the tender age of about 6 months old, because his mom, Queen Mary of Scots, was involved in a plot to kill her cousin, Elizabeth I, I think, and she was either Elizabeth or Virginia, I can't remember which queen, but she was arrested and was, locked up, and once she was locked up, her son, James, became King James VI of Scotland. As he grew, by the time he got to be a young man, his position in the hierarchy had risen to the point where he became King James I of England. It was he who coined the term Great Britain, where Great Britain represents England, Ireland, and Scotland. It was during his reign and his years where we had the rise of the, and prior to, had the rise of the conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics. So much history to be learned if you just start, looking. But what was most significant to me that I learned about him was that as the King of England, he was actually the monarch who established the first English colony here in what is now known as America. That colony was first established in 1604. It was formally organized in 1607. It's known by the name of Virginia, and its capital is called what? Jamestown, as in King James.
There's a James River there as well.
Exactly. There's a lot of things. Virginia itself, the state, is named after Queen Virginia. So you see the names throughout, right? What was most significant to me, though, was I learned that he didn't die until 1625. But I had known previously that our ancestors were first introduced here enslaved in 1619. So understanding how those things worked, it immediately occurred to me, I was shocked with what occurred to me. What that means is that in 1619, when our ancestors were first brought here, with him being the monarch, he actually wrote the agreement with the Pilgrims. That happened in 1620. That was down the road. But when our ancestors were brought here, before they were brought here, somebody would have had to go to him as the monarch and say to him, as they would have said then, "My Lord." We found that the Dutch have located a virtual unlimited labor pool on the continent of Africa, and we would like to begin to import those people to begin doing our work. We're having such a difficult time getting the indigenous people to do the work that we need to do. And since we can't bring enough Europeans over here, we would like to begin to import enslaved Africans to do our work. And then he would have had to say, as he did, "You may." He's the monarch. It's not a democracy. He didn't have a committee of people who made decisions like that. He made decisions like that himself. So when it occurred to me that the namesake of the book that I had been taught to accept as the unadulterated Word of God was also the person who had authority over the introduction of my ancestors enslaved, I couldn't touch that book. That book was hot. It literally got hot to the touch. And it wasn't until after I had that experience with that sister, and I realized that I needed to pick this book back up, and I needed to pick up where I left off, and I needed to begin mastering this book as much as I was trying to master all of these other books, that it no longer was hot to the touch, So I use this in answer to the question. I use a discussion about who King James is, because that shocks people like it shocked me. And it makes people realize that there's a whole lot more going on to this story than they ever imagined. And if they're ever going to see their way clear, they got to stop listening to that recording.